Less than a century ago, China was weak, divided, and humiliated. Foreign powers controlled its trade, its economy, and even parts of its land. Today, China is one of the most powerful nations on Earth. So how did it rise so fast? For centuries, China was one of the world's greatest civilizations, rich in culture, technology, and power. But everything began to fall apart in the 1800s, when Western powers arrived, not as partners, but as conquerors. In the early 1800s, a dangerous trade began to take hold in China. British merchants were selling opium, a powerful and highly addictive drug, into the country. Over time, millions of Chinese people became dependent on it. The impact was devastating. Families collapsed, the economy weakened, and the government grew alarmed. Determined to stop the crisis, the Qing dynasty banned the opium trade. Chinese officials confiscated and destroyed vast amounts of British opium. Britain refused to accept it. Instead, it answered with military force. And just like that, the First Opium War began. The Opium Wars forced China to open its markets, weakening its control and allowing foreign powers to carve out influence across its territory. At the same time, internal rebellions spread, causing massive loss of life and further destabilizing the Qing dynasty. By the early 1900s, Imperial China had collapsed. What remained was a divided nation struggling to survive amid chaos and fragmentation. After the empire fell, China did not find peace. Instead, the country slipped into chaos. With no strong central authority, power was seized by regional warlords who ruled their territories like independent kingdoms. They fought one another constantly, each trying to expand their control, while ordinary people were left caught in the middle of endless conflict. In the midst of this fragmentation, a fragile republic was formed. It struggled to bring order to a nation that no longer felt unified, but its authority was weak and often ignored outside the major cities. Just as stability seemed out of reach, a new and far more defining struggle began to take shape. China was pulled into a civil war, one that would decide its future. On one side stood the nationalists fighting to build a centralized state. On the other were the communists, driven by a vision of a completely different China. What followed was not just a battle for power, but a fight over the very identity of the nation itself. But before the civil war could reach a conclusion, another catastrophe struck. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Cities were bombed, villages were destroyed, and millions of lives were caught in the violence of a war that engulfed the entire nation. For years, China was forced to fight not only its internal divisions, but also an external enemy that brought destruction on an unprecedented scale. When World War II finally ended, the fighting inside China did not stop. The civil war between the nationalists and the communists resumed, even after everything the country had already endured. This time, the struggle moved quickly toward its final outcome. By 1949, the balance of power had shifted decisively. The nationalists retreated and the communists gained control of the mainland. Mao Zedong declared victory. From the ruins of decades of war and collapse, a new state was born, the People's Republic of China. After coming to power, Mao Zedong promised to rebuild China, restore its strength, its independence, and its place in the world. The nation had been through decades of war, and hope for renewal was strong. But the path chosen to achieve that vision came with immense consequences. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a sweeping campaign designed to rapidly transform China from an agrarian society into an industrial power. Factories were pushed to expand, and farming was reorganized on a massive scale. But the system was poorly managed, and reality quickly fell apart. Agricultural production collapsed, food shortages spread, and famine took hold across the country. What followed was one of the deadliest humanitarian disasters in history, with millions losing their lives. Years later, in 1966, Mao initiated another nationwide movement, the Cultural Revolution. It was meant to reshape Chinese society and enforce revolutionary ideals. But instead, it tore the country apart. Schools and institutions shut down, cultural heritage was destroyed, and suspicion turned people against one another. Millions were persecuted in the chaos that followed. By the time Mao died in 1976, China had changed, but not in the way he had promised. The country remained poor, largely isolated from the world, and still struggling to recover from decades of... Then, everything began to change. After years of isolation and struggle, a new leader came forward, Deng Xiaoping. He saw clearly what the past decades had revealed. China could not grow by shutting itself off from the world. Strength would not come from isolation, but from reform. In 1978, he set a new course in motion. China slowly began to open its doors. Foreign companies were invited to invest, and ideas from outside began to enter the country again. The strict control over the economy was eased, allowing markets to play a larger role. Even farmers, who had long been bound by collective systems, were given more freedom over what they produced. Along the coast, new special economic zones were created, small regions that became testing grounds for change. What were once quiet areas began transforming into busy centers of industry, trade, and opportunity. The impact was immediate and powerful. Factories rose where there had been little before. Exports increased rapidly. Jobs multiplied, drawing millions into newly built cities and industrial zones. After decades of war, famine, and political upheaval, China was finally moving again. Not backward this time, but forward, into a new era of rapid growth and transformation.
Over the following decades, China changed at a speed the world had rarely seen before. Cities expanded outward and upward almost overnight, reshaping the landscape into vast urban centers. Quiet villages were gradually absorbed, transforming into sprawling megacities filled with towers, roads, and constant movement. As industry grew, China became known as the world's factory. In enormous production hubs, goods were manufactured on a scale that supplied markets across the globe, from clothing and household items to advanced electronics. This rapid expansion lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, reshaping everyday life for a large part of the population. Alongside this economic rise came massive development on the ground. High-speed rail networks connected distant regions, highways stretched across the country, and major ports expanded to handle global trade. With each passing year, China's economy grew stronger, and with it, its presence in the world became more significant and far-reaching. Today, China stands at the center of global power. Its cities stretch into the sky, its economy rivals the largest on Earth, and its influence reaches far beyond its borders. Across Asia, Africa, and even Europe, China is building roads, railways, and ports, linking continents through its Belt and Road Initiative. At the same time, a new rivalry is unfolding. In technology, trade, and global leadership, China now stands face-to-face with the United States. From artificial intelligence to space exploration, this is no longer a nation trying to catch up. It is a nation shaping what comes next. In less than a century, China rewrote its destiny. From collapse to revolution to the rise of a global power, its journey has reshaped the modern world. What once seemed impossible became reality. But this story isn't over. China is still rising, still evolving, and now the future remains unwritten. The only question is, what comes next?